Behind the headlines, there's something powerful at work that you don't often hear in the news. It's people helping people. All over the world, Red Cross teams are helping those who need it most. You can be one of the helpers too. Search Red Cross to donate today.
Yesterday, a verdict was handed down in the defamation trial of former SAS soldier Ben RobertsSmith.
In accordance with the practice of the Federal Court in cases of public interest, the following summary has been prepared to accompany the orders made today.
Justice Anthony Basenko found that the news outlets RobertsSmith was suing had established the substantial truth of the key allegation in the case, that RobertsSmith was involved in the unlawful killing of unarmed Afghan prisoners.
The applicant, while a member of the SASR, murdered an unarmed and defenceless Afghan civilian by kicking him off a cliff and procuring the soldiers under his command to shoot him. Imputation 1. 2. The applicant broke the moral and legal...
It is a major victory for the newspapers, with the findings sufficient that the justice has now dismissed RobertsSmith's lawsuit.
I am satisfied that the respondents have made out a defence of contextual truth with respect to that imputation. In light of my conclusions, each proceeding must be dismissed.
For more on the verdict on what's become known as the defamation trial of the century, listen to Please Explain on Monday. Nick McKenzie, the investigative journalist who broke the Ben RobertsSmith story, will be talking to the Age and Sydney Morning Herald's executive editor, Tori McGuire. But for now, here's Jacqueline Maley to guide you through the week in politics.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, June 2.
Right, thank you so much for coming at such short notice. I'm going to read out a brief...
Earlier this week, on the eve of his 30th year in politics, Mark McGowan announced that he would be stepping down as Western Australia's Premier.
But the truth is, I'm tired. Extremely tired. In fact, I'm exhausted. The role of political leadership doesn't...
His resignation came as a shock to many.
This week will be my final week. It's not a decision I've taken lightly.
So why has Mark McGowan decided to resign now? How much has McGowan's way of doing politics impacted the Labor Party and Anthony Albanese himself? And what does his departure mean for Labor in WA? And there are now calls for former Cabinet Minister Stuart Robert to face the government's new anti-corruption watchdog. These calls come after months of revelations into Stuart Robert's dealings with private consultants who he helped go after lucrative deals with federal agencies. Today, WA Today's state political reporter Hamish Hastie and chief political correspondent for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald David Crowe join me to discuss the week in politics. Welcome Hamish and welcome David.
G'day Jackie, thanks for having me.
Hamish, I want to start by talking about the resignation of Mark McGowan, WA's now former Premier. Just how much of a surprise was his decision to resign over there?
Truthfully, it was a huge shock. I mean, he seemed like he was in the prime of his political life. He was, in the months leading up, he was very, had a lot of energy, was still kind of engaging in, the verbal spats with anyone and everyone. Even that morning, I asked his office whether there was any plans for him to come out that day. They said, no, it's going to be a quiet one. And then 2 hours later, we get a cryptic alert saying, he's going to be speaking in the government media room. And that's kind of when our imaginations ran wild. And then, he just dropped that bombshell.
A lesson, if nothing else, in how easily media advisors for politicians lie to the media. Hamish, for those of us who don't follow WA politics very closely, what should we know about Mark McGowan? He made a real name for himself in the pandemic, particularly over here in the eastern states. But what were his attributes and strengths and weaknesses as Premier?
He did. I mean, he swept to power in 2017. It was a very significant victory for Labor. He beat the incumbent Premier at the time, the Liberal Colin Barnett, winning the largest majority government in the state's history at that time. Then, 4 years later, with a year of pandemic under his belt, he became Mr. 91% and smashed that record even further, leaving only 2 Liberal MPs and 4 National MPs in the lower house, which is just a wall of red in there. I guess his first couple of years in government were kind of middle of the road. There were no kind of major missteps, but there wasn't anything to write home about. But the pandemic was really when he shined. I think he tapped into an undercurrent of parochialism in WA, which has always been there ever since Federation, I think. And he just kind of set that into hyperdrive and, used the borders to his advantage, to his electoral advantage. It was just a really successful policy for him here. Beyond that, I guess he kind of kept evolving down that path, and the GST fight's been a big one. A lot of West Australians who don't like the idea of money that they spend here going to any other state. So he's just been a master of tapping into that parochialism.
Yeah, David, I want to bring you in here. What do you think was the secret to McGowan's success? He won the largest majority in the state's history. He improved that majority, and then he got that record-breaking approval rating of 91%. Surely other politicians must be looking at him and thinking, how can I have what he's having?
They would, and they do. Some others are able to match it to a certain extent. I guess he's the exemplar of the strong state leader who took on Canberra and appealed to his own state in a way that really worked, resonated with them. I think a key point is he came in after 9 years of former coalition government under Colin Barnett. So there was a sense that the previous government had run its race. He came in, appealed to the middle ground, pretty down to earth in the way that he dealt with people, and from the start was very aggressive or assertive in standing up for his state against Canberra. And that then went into, a whole kind of hyperdrive really during the pandemic, because that was a moment in time where voters clearly rewarded premiers who closed borders, who stood up for their own communities against the nation. In a sense, there was a shift in power to the states. He wasn't the only premier who succeeded with that approach. Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland had strong support for her sort of state-first approach during the pandemic, and I think Daniel Andrews also had that. Sure, there's more divisive opinions in Victoria about his time as premier during this period, but the same approach of states first was taken. So I don't think that we can look at WA and think, look, it's an exceptional case. It's true that there is a deeper feeling of, I guess, states' rights there. I mean, they voted to secede in 1930, right? So that's always been there, but I don't think it's peculiar to WA.
He took obviously a very hard line on state border closures, but more generally he had a very centrist approach, didn't he? And that helped him perhaps achieve his historic victory. He said that that's what you've got to do in political life. You have got to appeal to everyone. Is that something that Anthony Albanese, for example, might take to heart or might seek to emulate?
I think that if Anthony Albanese had his way, he would continue running a government in a sense on the Mark McGowan model. Pretty strong leader, pretty down to earth in the way that he deals with most questions, and appealing to the middle ground. I mean, bear in mind, when Mark McGowan announced his resignation, he pointed to things he was proud of, such as environmental protection in WA. At the same time, however, he was always standing up for the ability of WA industry to export more iron ore, export more gas, export more oil. So those resource industries were, fundamental to the economic well-being of the state, and he stood up for that at a time when that wasn't all that popular in some quarters of the Labor Party. So the middle ground there was where Mark McGowan positioned himself, and that worked.
Hamish, how do you think McGowan's performance has influenced Anthony Albanese and Labor politics more broadly? Do you think he's created a sort of playbook for Labor politicians who want to occupy that central ground?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And he said in the past that, he's offered advice to Albanese on those terms to kind of help Middle Australia more. In WA, I guess McGowan's Labor government is kind of seen as the best Conservative government the state's ever seen. He understands that the economy plays a massive role in the electability of leaders and political parties. So David's right. He has prioritised business and, jobs and growth, to borrow a term from the coalition, over everything else. And I think the new Labor Premier, Roger Cook, will be borrowing heavily from the playbook that he's written. And McGowan's kind of set the rules for any party that wants to be successful in WA, and those lessons can be transferred across the country.
Given this enormous popularity and this wonderful performance, what insight do we have into why McGowan has resigned at the peak of his powers?
Well, as I mentioned, it was a huge surprise. There's lots of conspiracy theories bandying about, but he says he was tired, and the first I saw of that was in that press conference where he did genuinely seem quite spent. He does have some young kids, teenagers turning into adults soon. He's probably not seen his wife much. So I guess the exhaustion, the tiredness, that does make sense. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in a board role on a WA mining company somewhere. That's what famously happened to Ben Wyatt, the former treasurer here. And he's on a very, very good pension scheme, which only 2 MPs, himself and the Speaker of the House here, Michelle Roberts, are entitled to. So he'll get about $275,000 a year in retirement fees, and he can still work as well. So, a golden handshake like that's as good a reason as any to get out.
Finally, I want to ask you both how you think McGowan's resignation will weaken support for Labor, or if you think it will weaken support for Labor in the state, because, Labor's really enjoyed a golden period of politics in WA that doesn't come around easily for them in that stage. David, I'll go to you first. Is it something that Anthony Albanese should be concerned about, that the popularity of Labor in WA will now weaken?
Yes, he should be concerned about it. That would be natural. I don't know whether there's much he can do to stop it. The only way is down from the record highs that Labor has in WA. It's hard to see the new Premier really building on a 91% approval rating. So this is the way in which the cycle of politics works. But I'm not convinced that simply because Mark McGowan has moved on, that therefore there is an erosion in federal Labor support in WA that's going to cause grief for Anthony Albanese. There's that working theory that Albanese only achieved the great success in WA federal seats at the last election because of McGowan and can only hold them because of McGowan. I don't think that follows. Albanese, we've seen, has become quite popular in office. He's found a way to build on their success at the last election, and I think that means that there is a way for Labor at a federal level to hold the seats that it's got in WA.
Hamish, what do you think? Do you think that Albanese will be able to not only hold on to those federal seats in WA, but maybe even win some more? Will they, be able to hold on to the enormous successes they had at the last election in WA?
Yeah, I agree with David. McGowan's popularity definitely played a factor in last year's election, but the unpopularity of Scott Morrison was equal, if not more. Calling West Australians cavemen, that was kind of repeated over and over throughout the campaign, and that really sunk in a lot of voters' minds. So I think if Albanese does refer back to that playbook that McGowan's written, not touching GST, ensuring the viability of the mining industry, that kind of stuff, that there is a chance that they could win some seats that are already kind of teetering on the knife edge, like Moore. They would love to win Canning because Andrew Hastie has been a pretty vocal critic of the state Labor Party here as well. But yeah, it's not out of the realms of possibility.
Well, Hamish, here at Please Explain, we would never be so disparaging about West Australians. Quite the contrary. Thank you so much for coming on this show. We'd love to have you back sometime.
Awesome. Thank you. See ya.
David, let's talk now about former Cabinet Minister Stuart Robert. His recent sudden resignation has triggered a by-election set to be held in July in the seat of Fadden in Queensland, which Albanese sees as another opportunity for Labor, he said this week. I want you to tell us a little bit about the events that led up to Robert's resignation, because this is something that you've been writing about a lot recently.
Well, we began writing, I guess, more about Stuart Robert around November or December last year, after our colleague Nick McKenzie gained access to a whole tranche of emails, including from Stuart Robert's private Gmail account, that revealed conversations going on in the background while Stuart Robert was a backbencher and a minister. So it certainly gave rise to questions about the information that he was sharing with friends who, in one case, was running a consulting firm that was bidding for federal work and advising big companies, global companies, on winning major contracts with the federal government. Now, once we exposed these conversations, it became clear that there were concerns about whether the contracts that federal agencies had entered into with companies linked to Stuart Robert's consultant friend were in some ways questionable because of the information being exchanged in the background. That then led to a federal investigation on behalf of Services Australia and the National Disability Insurance Agency. And they looked at contracts worth about $374 million that were linked to this one consultant firm, Synergy 360. So with all these questions about major contracts in mind, there was a lot of pressure on Stuart Robert to sort of reveal whether he was helping companies in the background get deals with the Commonwealth at taxpayer expense. His answer consistently has been that he didn't offer any of this help. You know, he said to me most recently, I was not paid by any party for any activity. I never sought any payment. None has ever been offered. I never assisted any companies to win any contracts. If my advice is sought, I provide it freely. So it was characterised as helping his friend with advice, free advice, I suppose. But I don't think it's going to end there, because this week in Senate estimates, a question was put to the Special Minister of State, Don Farrell, about whether the government had ruled out referring this to the federal anti-corruption watchdog. And the minister said, no, I don't rule that out. It's the question that is now hanging over Stuart Robert. Are the concerns so great that this needs to go to the National Anti-Corruption Commission? Because really only that commission would have the power to uncover maybe the financial paper trail to learn more about the relationships here.
Yeah, and we should say at this point that there have been no findings of wrongdoing against Robert, and he does deny all and any wrongdoing. The federal integrity body, IBAC, won't sort of fire up its engines till July 1st, and we don't know yet whether or not this will form part of one of their investigations. But I want to segue now to the more generally the interaction of government with the private sector. It's not always transparent. It happens all the time in Parliament House. But we have seen it play out in a different way with the PWC scandal engulfing Canberra at the moment. PWC, for those who haven't been following closely, PWC was engaged by the Australian government to help develop rules or protocols to stop multinational companies avoid tax. And then it seems to have used that confidential information to then advise their big corporate clients how to avoid those very laws that they've helped design. And that has resulted in big corporates avoiding tax that's owed to the Australian people. It's a clear conflict of interest, and it's a controversy that's being scrutinised at Senate estimates this week. How common is it for these private consultancies, David, to work with government? And do you think we're going to see the government rely a lot less on these consultants from now on? Can we trust them?
I think the scandal over PWC means that the message to government is no, you cannot trust them. And that may seem unfair to other consultants who are not caught up in this PWC scandal. However, it seems a logical conclusion for the government to be extremely wary here. But there are two different sides of this. One is the way in which consultants are now being used on contract to provide services to the government, which the government pays for. That's grown like topsy. So there's huge money now being spent on outsourcing. And so there's a real debate now about stopping the outsourcing and actually turning it the other way around. And I think that's going to be a determined approach by this current government, because they're trying to disclose more information about all these contracts, which are costing about $20 billion a year. We need to treat that number with care, because about 3/4 of it is defence work, and I don't think defence work can all be brought back in-house, right? However, there's billions of dollars being spent on consultants, and a lot of that is going to PWC, EY, KPMG, Accenture, and others. And so there's a spotlight on that. What was happening with the PWC tax scandal was that it wasn't being paid by Treasury to do work. Treasury was voluntarily bringing PWC into the tent to consult with it and others on a draft law that was meant to crack down on multinational tax avoidance. PWC was breaching a confidentiality agreement, according to the Tax Practitioners Board, and sharing that information around the world so it could sign up new clients and circumvent that very law. So that's a different issue, and I think that highlights this bizarre situation to anybody outside Canberra about the way in which federal officials the gamekeepers would basically call in the poachers to help them set up the system.
That's the metaphor that I was reaching for myself, that you're asking the poachers to become gamekeepers for a minute and then sending them back to be poachers again, which seems like perhaps a foolhardy decision in the first place. More broadly on integrity measures, Labor joined forces with the Coalition recently to vote against an amendment to the Infrastructure Australia Bill, which was aimed at stamping out pork barrelling. And of course, we saw a lot of pork barrelling under the Morrison government with the infrastructure projects. The amendment, which was shot down, would have required a cost-benefit analysis of any project that was worth more than $100 million, but Labor said no to it and it didn't get up. One of the key issues people voted on at the last election was integrity. Is the Albanese government committed enough to that cause, or has it gotten a bit lackadaisical now it's actually one government?
I think we're at a really interesting point in this question over transparency and disclosure, accountability. The Teal independents wanted this tougher test for infrastructure spending on grants, but Labor wouldn't have any bar of that. And I think that is a curious sort of step backward from greater transparency. Billions of dollars going into these road, rail and other projects around the country. What's so wrong with having a cost-benefit analysis done on everything that's over a certain value? That's all the Teals were asking for here, and this was a move led by Allegra Spender, the member for Wentworth. Government wouldn't have it. And I think that means there'll be questions in the future about whether projects Labor wants to build have actually passed the cost-benefit analysis and are actually worth the money. But at the same time, we're seeing the Stuart Robert emails revealing more about what's going on in the background, things that we always suspect are going on in the background with this exchange of information, but now we have a better indication of how it works. Same with PWC. It took 5 years for these emails to be revealed, telling us that confidential information was being bandied around among tax experts to circumvent the law. Again, I think it's something that we suspect is always going on. Now here's the email in black and white on a printed page that we've got as a result of the documents. So it sort of captures this moment where there is a frustration over the workings of government, a demand for greater transparency and accountability. And so I think when you look at it that way, Labor was on the wrong side of the argument on that call for greater transparency about infrastructure spending. Maybe now it's in power, Labor doesn't want as much scrutiny as it would have applied or wanted on the previous government.
Certainly very interesting issues to keep watching. And one of my bugbears has always been that federal parliamentarians or federal ministers are not required to publish their diaries, so we actually know who they're meeting and who they're being lobbied by every day. David, thank you so much for talking to us. It's always a pleasure, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, Jackie. Talk then.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance from Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
Renewable gases such as green hydrogen provide all the great benefits of natural gas, but with zero carbon emissions when burned. By blending and ultimately replacing natural gas with renewable gas, customers can continue to enjoy the gas flame for cooking, heating and hot water in their home. The journey towards 100% renewable gas has already started. To find out more, search renewable gas or visit renewable-gas.com.au. Renewable gas, we're changing gas for good.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra. I'd like to tell you about 2 excellent online resources. They're both free and easy to use. Perfect for small businesses and new employers getting ready to hire staff. The Hiring Employees Checklist is a free step-by-step guide to take you through the hiring process from start to finish. And the Employment Contract Tool can help you create a basic employment contract that complies with workplace laws in just 10 minutes. These have been developed by the Australian Government as part of its support for small businesses. To find out more or to start using the Hiring Employees Checklist and the Employment Contract Tool, visit business.gov.au/employ.
The Safe and Sound B Compact iFix car seat with added safety features like advanced side impact cushion technology, plus iFix installation system is designed to fit your life, protecting what matters most. Britax.com.au.